Okay, welcome back, guys. We are week three, day two of online learning. You guys don't need to write this, and we're talking World War One. This first question is asking us about yesterday's PowerPoint, and it says, "What was the spark that started World War One? Who was involved?" If I was to ask you guys, you would tell me that it was the assassination of the Archduke of Austria Hungary, a guy named Franz Ferdinand, by a Serbian nationalist named Gavrilo Princip of the Black Hand. Because after that happened, Austria Hungary declared war on Serbia, and all you know what broke loose. So when you hear about the spark that ignited the powder keg in the Balkans, we're talking about Ferdinand's assassination. By the way, we're going to go through this PowerPoint. This is the one we got up to yesterday and stopped. And then, if we have time, we'll go through the next PowerPoint as well. We might not have time, but anyway, that's when I ask you what the causes were, you're going to tell me Maine. You're going to tell me militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism. So those are the long term causes. But when I ask you about the spark, you're going to tell me about the assassination. So by 1914, Europe had enjoyed a century of relative peace with one another for about 30 years. Um, Many idealists hoped for a permanent end to war. There were people that thought that essentially war could be eliminated from here on out. Some Europeans believed that progress had made war a thing of the past. Yet, in a little more than a decade, a massive war would engulf Europe and spread across the globe. So, while peace and harmony characterized much of Europe at the beginning of the 1900s, peace and harmony were less visible and darker forces were at work. So below the surface of peace and goodwill, Europe witnesses several gradual developments that ultimately propel the continent into war. Austria Hungary's declaration of war against Serbia set off a chain reaction with the alliance system. The countries of Europe followed through on their pledges to support one another. As a result, nearly all of Europe soon joined what would be the largest, most destructive war the world had seen yet. So by mid August 1914, the battle lines were clearly drawn. Oops. Let's go back, guys. By mid August 1914, the battle lines were clearly drawn. On one side were Germany and Austria Hungary. They were known as the Central Powers because of their location in the heart of Europe. Bulgaria and the Ottoman Empire would later join the Central Powers in the hopes of regaining lost territories. So, Bulgaria and the Ottoman Empire were places that countries that had previously had a lot of sway. They had larger empires, and they hoped that by hitching their wagon to the same train as Germany and Austria Hungary, they were hoping that they could sort of reclaim some of their glory. On the other side, you had Great Britain, France, and Russia. And we talked about this yesterday, so I'm not going to spend too much time. But um, Great Britain, France, and Russia initially and together they were known as the Allied powers, or just the Allies. Japan joins the Allies within weeks. Italy joins later. Italy had actually been a member of the Triple Alliance with Germany and Austria Hungary, but the Italians joined the other side after accusing their former partners of unjustly starting the war. So Italy basically said, we had an alliance with you that we would help to protect you if you were attacked, but we did not say that we would get on board automatically with any war that you want to wage. So the Italians join up with the Allies. Japan, you'll see, was an ally during World War One. But what's sad or ironic is that World War Two, which is not that far away from here, it's about 30 years or so. 20 years or so. There are mortal enemies, so it just these things go in cycles. The Schlieffen Plan, it's a plan by a German general named Alfred von Schlieffen. It's going to be a two pronged attack. So Germany was facing a war on two fronts, to the east and the west. And they developed a battle strategy known as the Schlieffen Plan. It's named after that guy, the designer. The plan's going to call for attacking and defeating France in the west and then rushing east to fight Russia. No pun intended. Germans felt like they could carry out a plan like this because Russia was way behind the rest of Europe in its railroad system. Thus, it would take Russia longer to supply its front lines. So Schlieffen and the other German military leaders felt like they could go wipe out France, take them over easily, and then turn their sights on Russia because they felt like Russia would still be playing catch up with getting the supplies to the front line. But the German leaders knew that in order for this to be effective, for this to work, they had to defeat France quickly. In other words, they could not let this become a long, drawn out battle with France. They had to go in and they had to be swift about it. And they were able to do that. France just wasn't equipped to defeat an army like Germany. Just for 1 second, and then we'll pick right back up where we left off. So there we go. We were talking about the Schlieffen Plan. So the Schleifen plan, um, basically, it appeared early on that Germany was going to do just what they wanted to do. That they were going to go beat France really quick and then turn back and surprise Russia. German forces had swept into France and they were right at the outskirts of Paris. And a major German victory looked like it was going to happen just in the next few days. Along comes September 5th, when the Allies are able to regroup and they attack the Germans northeast of Paris in the valley of a river called the Marne River. So every available soldier was hurled into the struggle. When reinforcements were needed, they literally, more than 600 taxi cabs rushed soldiers from Paris to the front. So they needed to get them there so quickly that they literally more or less commandeered taxi cabs. So after 4 days of fighting, the German generals gave their order to retreat. So again, France, they didn't have the might to defeat Germany by themselves. They would have fallen very swiftly. I may have misspoken earlier, but without the help of their allies, they would have been defeated. All right, the Western Front, and I think it's so cool that they've colorized these old World War One photos. So as the summer of 1914 is turning into fall, the war turns into this long and bloody stalemate. Stalemate basically just means a deadlock where neither side is able to defeat the other. So they're both taking losses, but neither one is really making any significant progress. The region that was deadlocked up here in northern France, they called that the Western Front. So right here is the Western Front. Trench warfare was another major factor in the war. So by early 1915, these opposing armies on the Western Front had dug miles of parallel trenches to protect themselves from enemy fire. Remember, modern weapons had made battle just sort of stand up in front of each other, ready aim fire. It made that obsolete, and it really raised the death toll. So, digging those parallel trenches, that is what sets the stage for trench warfare. And in that type of warfare, soldiers fight each other from the trenches. So, armies traded huge losses of human life for these teeny land gains. They were losing a ton of men and women, although they weren't on the front lines other than nurses. So, they were losing a ton of people, but they weren't really gaining anything. Life in the trenches was just absolute misery. The men slept in mud, washed in mud, ate mud, and dreamed mud, one soldier wrote. The trenches swarmed with rats. Fresh food was non existent. Sleep was nearly impossible. Guys would get infected, called trench foot. It's just a disgusting, really very difficult place to survive. The space between the opposing trenches was called no man's land. When the officers ordered an attack, their men went over the top of the trenches into the bombed out landscape. And usually, when they got up and went out into no man's land, they were met with rounds of machine gun fire. So getting up and going over the trenches was extremely dangerous, but staying put in the trench didn't exactly ensure that you were going to stay safe either, because artillery fire brought death right into the trenches. So even if you never left, you could still be killed. They wound up calling the Western Front a terrain of death, basically just death land. And it stretches about 500 miles. So from the North Sea to the border of Switzerland. Let's see if this will play for us. I don't believe it will, but that one's 9 minutes long, give or take. So If we have time at the end of this lesson, I might start it and then uh, I'll plan on posting it up on your classboard page. So, new weapons. I mentioned the machine gun, how the machine gun of war, but that wasn't the only innovation. Okay, where were we? Modern weapons are going to add greatly to the destructiveness of the war. I mentioned rapid fire machine guns who could just mow down waves of soldiers, made it nearly impossible to advance across no man's land. There was artillery that allowed troops to shell enemy lines and cities from more than 10 miles away. The tank. Now, in 1916, Britain introduced a new weapon, the armored tank. The tank was mounted with machine guns, and they were designed to move across broken ground and through barbed wire. Still, the first ones moved very slowly and they often broke down. They really didn't do a whole lot to break the stalemate. Poison gas was another new invention or something being used in war in the first time, for the first time on a wide scale. Germany was especially known for this. They began using poison gas that blinded or choked its victims or just caused agonizing blisters and burns. That was a war crime. Later that year, the Allies began to use gas as well. So soldiers were eventually given gas masks, but poison gas remained one of the most dreaded hazards of war. The problem is, or one of the many problems was that if you were the side shooting poison gas, it was not unheard of that you would shoot the gas bombs and that the wind could shift and it could blow it right back at your trench. So it was very, very risky to say the least. It was brutal when it was used and it was risky to use. Both sides used aircraft. At first, planes just observed enemy troop movements. And in 1915, Germany starts using Zeppelins, or these large gas filled balloons. They use Zeppelins to, and I don't mean balloons like, 50 balloons from the grocery store. I mean, these are massive. And they started using them to bomb England on the coast. As the war went on, both sides wound up putting machine guns on airplanes, and these pilots, they called them flying aces, are going to battle up in the sky. The dogfights, they called them, between these flying aces were spectacular, but they really didn't have a ton of effect on the course of the war. The most important piece of weaponry or innovation of war was a submarine. The submarine was much more important than the airplane. German subs are basically roaming the Atlantic. The submarine's primary weapon was the torpedo. The torpedo is just an underwater missile. So the U boats, that's what they call German subs, U boats, did tremendous damage to the Allied side. It sank merchant ships that carried supplies to Britain. And eventually, the Allies are going to organize convoys, basically a group of merchant ships that is going to travel protected by warships. The thing about Germany doing this unrestricted submarine warfare is that that's ultimately what's going to convince the United States to send in troops. So there's a group standing on top of a submarine. The machine gun shot 100 rounds a minute. It's more than, I mean, that's a lot. You guys can do the math. That's a lot. If I asked you, why did the Schlieffen plan fail, you would tell me that France got reinforcements and that Russia was able to mobilize and get to the front lines faster than people expected. So the Germans were not allowed to defeat France swiftly like they had hoped to be, and the Russians surprised the Central Powers by getting to the front lines and being ready to defend themselves faster than was expected. So I found this diagram, this depiction of what trench warfare really looked like. We'll just go from this way all around. So, aircraft, remember, initially was used mainly to track enemy movements and to surveil. Eventually, they're going to be used as what we think of as fighter planes. Down here, barbed wire played a very large role. It's not very technologically advanced, but just deep. It's not like the barbed wire we see now. If you guys have ever driven by a field on the side of some 2 lane road and they've got like a wire with little barbs here and there, this was razor sharp and it was wrapped over and over itself. So, really, just about impossible to pass. Down here, no man's land. That's this area between the trenches. Here's your front line trench. There's your support trench. So in this case, it's going to be going this way. You'd have dugouts, which were basically what they sound like. Germany could do ones that were 15 meters below ground. And the reason that dugouts were good, and they would put some sort of crude lighting in these dugouts, is they were immune more or less to shell fire. So you didn't have to worry about, if you were in that dugout, you didn't have to worry about getting blown up. So front trench, support trench, reserve trench, concrete blockhouse for a machine gun. So a blockhouse is essentially just a little, it's like making a cardboard box fort, except it was concrete and there was a little slit cut out that you could stick a machine gun out of. In the way back, they had their long range archery. That was, almost 10 miles, or excuse me, over 10 miles behind the front line. So those long range artillery, that long range artillery was important because they were able to shell enemy troops that were approaching their trenches. So I liked this depiction of trenches actually look like. It's simple, but it was a huge development. It contributed significantly to the huge death toll of the war because it's a little longer than we want to spend screen sharing. So we're not going to watch them in class.